the change to how we plan batteries is not going to have any impact on those thermal flows, and those are real wind projects. They've got consents and so on. So I think that Bramford Twinstead circuit, for example, which is, I feel like everyone knows lots about now. I think that's going to stay there, and there's the stability constraints as well, which again they're not being driven by battery.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Knight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk. So on today's podcast of the series, we are talking about the hot off the press news, which came out earlier this week, that National Grid is changing and I have to admit to being very much a layperson in this regard, but thankfully I'm joined by some experts, but National Grid have changed the assumptions it uses when it models battery storage. And this is hopefully, and Pete, Aston and Catherine Cleary, two of the Road Knight Taylor Connectologists who we got on today, will hopefully tell us that this is going to be absolutely game-changing in freeing up the grid queues and opening up what were the, I guess, perceived or modelled constraints in order to allow an awful lot more generation and storage to connect an awful lot earlier, because we did have some dates, connection timeframes going out to, I think, as bad as 2036. So I will just ask you two, Pete and Catherine, just to shoot the breeze over this. And I might ask one of you, and the first person I can actually see there is Pete. So I might just say, Pete, what is this all about?
Okay, so and I think Catherine should chip in on this as soon as I get something wrong. National Grid has some connection planning assumptions that they use when they're looking at new connections onto the network, and there's lots of assumptions built into that. But one of the assumptions is around batteries. So what should National Grid be modelling batteries' behaviour as when they're looking at new connections to the network? So traditionally, they've gone down a sort of pessimistic route, assuming that when you're at peak demand times on the system, that batteries are going to be importing power, charging, and making peak demand issues worse. And then when there's peak generation times on the network, that batteries are going to be exporting and making those adding to the export and discharging. And so when you have that really sort of worst case scenario modelling, it unsurprisingly ends up triggering lots of reinforcement across the network. And I think there's something like, and Catherine, correct me if I'm wrong here, 90 gigawatts worth of accepted to connect storage on the transmission system. So what National Grid are looking at doing is remodelling that and essentially assuming that batteries are going to be at 0 megawatts. Catherine, do you want to just sort of come in?
No, I think that was very much more eloquently done than I would. I think it's maybe worth a scene setting a little bit, in the sense that National Grid do something quite different from DNOs. So when we're talking about like looking at those worst case assumptions, that's very much how a DNO operates, isn't it, Pete? But National Grid, when they normally when they run studies to determine the connection date for a new connection, they are running what we call like a probabilistic economic dispatch model. So they're not just looking at kind of the worst winter day and the worst summer sunny day. They are running thousands of scenarios for every half hour throughout the year, and they are making kind of credible economic decisions about which generation's online. So if you've got a really sunny, really windy day in the summer, they're assuming that lots of thermal plant isn't generating because prices are low and it's not worth their while. So it's quite sophisticated, the modelling they do. So batteries were just this big sort of sore thumb of an outlier because they didn't really know what batteries were going to do. They just plonked them in at 100%. So I think NGESO have sort of held their hands up and said, well, that was just a bad assumption in what is otherwise actually a very sophisticated modelling approach. So I think we're all behind the change, and in some ways it just goes to show how good and how clever you can get when you sort of do marry up those like technological constraints and the kind of market conditions.
Well, I was going to throw a question back at you, Catherine. Is like some people listening might just go, well, that's fantastic that National Grid are going to be modelling batteries as zero, but isn't that just bonkers because they're not always zero? They're going to be at some level above zero for some of the time. So how on earth can National Grid turn around and make that decision? I think in the ears of some that might just sound like a really, I don't know, crossing your fingers and hoping for the best type of
Yeah,
scenario.
it's not, I don't think. So to be clear, National Grid, when they're assessing a connection, if a battery is applying to them, when they assess that 100 megawatt battery application, they're putting the other batteries to zero in the background. They're still looking at that battery having 100 megawatts of export and 100 megawatts of import. So it's perhaps not quite as simplistic as just sort of setting everyone to zero. But I guess the point here is that we do expect, and the market has been quite clear that we expect batteries, at least for the foreseeable future, to be largely driven by arbitrage revenues, don't we? I think so. So that does suggest that when pricing is high on the electricity networks, because we've got not enough generation, we expect batteries to be exporting, so helping the networks. And conversely, when pricing is very low overnight, we've got actually we struggle to have enough demand on the system, and we expect batteries to charge. So most of the time we do expect batteries to be basically doing the converse of what the constraint is on the network. So putting them at zero is actually quite a sensible halfway house, because when, about that 100 megawatt battery could be exporting 100 megawatts or importing 100 megawatts. So zero is effectively the kind of halfway hedged position. So I think it's quite a sensible strategic viewpoint. And also, I was chatting to someone today who I think had sort of taken the approach of this sort of seems great, but what if my battery wants to export? Am I going to get constrained? And understanding that actually you've still got your techs, you've still got your access rights. So if National Grid have messed this up, and they've perhaps taken a risk and been too optimistic, it is their risk. So they will have to manage that commercially, and they will have to commercially constrain people. So really, if there's anyone kind of taking a risk here, it's probably National Grid rather than the impact it's going to have on connected generators. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so, and I think as well that I think you touched on just then that the way National Grid operates at transmission is different from at distribution as well, isn't it? Because they have the ability to sort of constrain, financially, commercially constrain generators, whereas at distribution level, that's not really such a thing, is it? That sort of DNOs have generally looked at connections at distribution level as a sort of fit and forget, connect and forget approach, and you don't go back and play with them and unless you switch out the circuit that they're connected to or something and turn them off.
Yeah. Whereas at transmission, it's very dynamic, isn't it? We manage the system all the time, because it's obviously not cost effective to build a transmission system to be able to cope with every offshore wind farm generating at full pelts, every solar farm generating at full pelts. So yeah, we have that continuous kind of economic cost benefit analysis of, should I build another bit of network, or should I just pay some curtailment payments to some generators? And I think that's that's a huge success of the GB electricity system that maybe we don't parade enough.
Yeah, and that's backed up again, I guess, by sort of technical systems to allow National Grid to implement those constraints as well, isn't it? The sort of visibility and control type requirements that transmission connections have that might be a bit more superior, a bit more involved than a distribution.
Yeah, and probably even than a distribution kind of active network management scheme. Your requirements as a transmission connected customer are a lot more arduous. You're submitting what are called physical notifications, but basically you're submitting your predicted power output on a half hour by half hour basis to National Grid, so they've got a really good idea about what's coming up. So that's a bit of a game changer as well in terms of operability for them. I think people are still maybe concerned because perhaps it's like you often hear, don't you, about the sort of National Grid control room and it being quite a sort of manual process still to take curtailment actions, and do you just ring your mate in a big hydro plant or a big power station, because that if you ask him to do something, it could be her, that they're going to respond to that action, and you've kind of got a reputation and a relationship. Whereas this newfangled battery, you might not really have had any kind of operational relationship with the asset owner. So I think there is a question about that, about how perhaps National Grid might have to change their processes, automate more, so that people really trust the kind of constraint mechanisms. But I think it's a first step. Like this change in the construction planning assumptions is a really huge step forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that slightly confuses me about it, and maybe it will, or maybe you can help me in a minute, or maybe it will just become clear over time, is that it's only in England and Wales at the moment, and that the Scottish TOs haven't yet moved into having the same assumptions. But I'm also aware that it's a GB wide network. So does National Grid in England and Wales, what do they assume about the batteries connected in Scotland? So I haven't quite got my head around yet how National Grid are and the Scottish TOs are sort of coordinating or otherwise.
I think probably to anyone outside, perhaps sort of 20 people in National Grid and 10 people in Scottish Power and SSEN, it's a little bit of a black box to us, isn't it? We talk about CPAs, and I think I was on a great call the other day where someone who's very, very well respected in the industry just said, "Am I having a senior moment? What is a CPA?" And I thought, oh, good on him for speaking out, because this is basically something which up until now has happened behind the scenes. So National Grid actually, as the ESO, have created the construction planning assumptions and handed them over to the TOs. They've said this is what you should consider in the background model. So we tend to kind of think of the ESO just being the gatekeeper for applications, and handing all of the study work over to the transmission owner. So I think that's that's kind of always been like a little bit of a reminder or like learning for all of us that actually the ESO are setting the assumptions and then the TO is kind of turning the handle. So I think my reading of this is that the ESO is saying this is where we're going. This is where GB wide is going. We've already had the conversation with NGESO. So in England and Wales, they're comfortable that we're changing the assumptions for them doing their power system analysis. I think they're having the conversation with Scottish Power Transmission. I think they haven't yet had the conversation with SSEN. So I'm predicting that this is all going to follow. So I think within 6 months we're going to be talking about this as GB wide assumptions. I don't think we can just, as you say, we can't divvy off England and Wales, can we?
It'd be crazy to think that you only assume the batteries in England and Wales are at zero and everything in Scotland's just at full output.
I guess it does make sense in some ways. I can understand why they picked England and Wales first, because I think that it's National Grid ET who are pointing out that actually it's batteries on their network which is having a real impact on these connection dates. So like 2036, Hugh, you mentioned. I mean, what's amazing, it's 2036. That's not for connections in the Northwest Highlands. 2036 is for connections in in North Wales, potentially in some of the Northwest, potentially in the Southwest as well. So so in England, so it's the constraints that NGESO are seeing, I think, have triggered them getting to almost sort of breaking point, I think, in terms of what they can assess. And I suppose the wins in England and Wales could be quite big. So I think if I was sitting on a connection offer with a 2030 something date in England and Wales, I'd be really quite optimistic about this process, helping to bring that forward. Whereas if I was sitting on a connection offer for the north of Scotland, I think a lot of those constraints are driven by more real problems. So a lot of offshore wind, and they maybe aren't going to come forward so quickly, even once they get implemented. So it makes sense. I think they've taken an 80-20 approach.
Because it also appears to me that there are possibly areas in England and Wales where there are real problems as well, that haven't just been caused by batteries. So like one of the areas, East Anglia, you've got a lot of offshore wind predicted to come into East Anglia. You've got Sizewell C, new nuclear power station. They are long time scale, but real schemes that are going to be coming forward slowly over the next sort of 10 years. And I wonder whether just reassessing the way batteries are modelled in that part of the world, is that really going to make the big difference that we all hope it will? Or are there sort of still real concerns there, real constraints that are going to be triggered anyway, even if you assume every battery's running at zero? And I haven't quite got my head around that yet.
If you're liking this podcast so far, you may want to pop over to the Connectology page on Road Knight Taylor's website and sign up to the Connectology newsletter for much more know-how, insight and thought leadership in electricity network connections. The link to this is in the description. Don't miss out on any of the articles, explainers, videos, webinars and podcasts that Road Night Taylor's Connectologists share to give you an edge and help you overcome your grid frustrations. And just to be clear, that we've been talking about the sort of transmission connected projects, but actually we're also their modelling assumptions. Am I right that they're actually going to be modelling, using these assumptions for modelling all of those embedded generators, embedded storage rather, as well?
Yeah, I think there are two levels to that, Hugh. One is every embedded connection onto the distribution networks goes through the project progression or statement of works process and gets assessed by National Grid ESO in terms of what reinforcement works they have to sit behind. So there's lots of embedded customers who are getting really long connection timescales because of these large transmission reinforcement schemes. So the way that I believe the process is going to be working is that National Grid will go back and amend not only the connection offers for directly connected transmission customers, but will also be amending the modification offers that they've issued to DNOs, which will then flow through to embedded customers. So there could be connection dates that improve for embedded customers in relation to those wider transmission constraints. How then those changes into the connection planning assumptions impact on the way batteries are modelled at grid supply point level, I'm not yet sure, and I don't know if Catherine, if you're back, whether you've heard around exactly what they're going to be doing at GSP level, and whether that changes compared to what they're doing at sort of wider transmission level.
So Grid do model what happens for like distribution connected customers in this this sort of economic dispatch analysis that we've been talking about, the construction planning assumptions that go with it. That does include assumptions around what happens at distribution. It's quite interesting. So they actually do things like apply attrition rates to projects. So Grid say, well, we've looked at the last over the last 10 years of operation. We know that not everyone who applies to us actually builds out a connection. We know that people who haven't got their planning consent are even less likely to build out a connection. So we actually assume that between like half and a third of generation projects just drop out of the queue at some point because they never get built. And they apply that, interestingly, at distribution as well as at transmission, and that's all for setting the background. But it means that I think there's this really clear kind of conversation point to say, well, should we be doing the same thing at distribution? So when a DNO is applying, they're submitting their Appendix G data or they're applying for a project progression, should there be some kind of diversity around those assumptions? Because if there was, I think that would be really helpful for actually kind of, it would just mean we could get people moving, get projects connected, and then get to a kind of a okay, well, actually, maybe if everyone does want to connect, now we have higher constraint levels until we've built this reinforcement. I think the emphasis is very clearly on, not just kind of ignoring distributed energy resources because it's hard. So I think National Grid want to do something about that. And I imagine that I guess they have to go and talk to the DNOs, don't they, Pete? Because ultimately it's how a DNO submits a MODAP or a project progression, which is going to shape how it affects their customers.
Yeah, and there are quite a few, lots of grid supply points across the country where reinforcement of supergrid transformers has been triggered specifically because of battery connections, either export or import or both. And it's in those sort of scenarios where I guess if those assumptions change and improve, that customers might see not only reductions in timescales, but potentially in some places could see reductions in cost if they're not having to contribute towards paying for supergrid transformer reinforcement. So it's really got quite a significant knock-on process.
Interestingly, I saw I'm sure loads of people will have been on a call a couple of days ago about the kind of two-stage offer process, and that also dealt with the way that National Grid had to pick up these changes. But interestingly, I thought Susanna put up a slide which was who's the head of connections, put up a slide which showed all of the different initiatives that National Grid have got to basically try and get to a more efficient transmission connections sort of regime, and there were a scary number on that slide, but one of them, which I don't think has been talked about very much, is a policy sort of development program to set grid supply point limits. So this is like all about giving the DNO control on those SGT assets. So saying, you have, they're your customer assets, this is the rating, or this is your contractual limit associated with that, now you go and manage it. And I think it's interesting because I think there's no time frame, as far as I'm aware, on when that's going to be deployed, but once it is deployed, it'll suddenly change the emphasis, because I think the DNOs will be far more engaged with managing this process, and it's not just National Grid have said X, it's no, actually this is something I can control within my limits.
Yeah, and I think that'll be really interesting to see how the DNOs then respond to that, because they then need the systems in place to be able to control generation on their own network, both sort of commercially and technically. And I mean, some DNOs have got the I guess the sort of start of those technical solutions with active network management and so on, being able to control generators. But I think perhaps there's a lot of that commercial development that potentially needs to happen on the DNO side to allow them to have control those generators in the way that they need to.
But it's a bit of an obvious gauntlet, isn't it? I think people across the industry will say, well, actually, we've changed the fundamental assumptions at transmission. Can't we change them? These are the same batteries we're talking about. They're all playing in the same market. Can't we change them at distribution?
Absolutely. I imagine that all the DNOs are now going to get bombarded with questions from developers going, well, if National Grid can do this at transmission level, why on earth can't you make these same assumptions at distribution level and therefore free up capacity so that we can connect more schemes? So I would imagine that some DNOs are starting going to get telephone calls and emails. To that.
Doesn't this solve my problem? I suppose, I think, going back to what you asked, Pete, earlier about there are some problems it doesn't solve. So like East Anglia, for example, a lot of those 2028 dates, they're based on a system reinforcement, which is being triggered sort of by two things. One is like the level of offshore wind connecting into East Anglia. Now, the change to how we plan batteries is not going to have any impact on those thermal flows. And those are real wind projects, they've got consents and so on. So I think that Bramford Twinstead circuit, for example, which I feel like everyone knows lots about now, I think that's going to stay there, and there's the stability constraints as well, which again they're not being driven by batteries. So I think there are lots of constraints which are going to stay. I was quite encouraged by I think Grid sort of have put together some ideas about what are they going to do where changing the CPA assumptions don't result in earlier connection dates, and I think they've got more serious about kind of looking at non-firm products. I think the kind of like stage connections, obviously everyone got very enthusiastic about, and then I think National Grid said actually there's a limit to how much we can stage people behind intertrips and so on. So I think there's a desire to look at that again, and also kind of like delayed enabling works is what they're calling it at the moment, I think, which is basically like, can I sort of borrow the capacity temporarily off someone else because it's my enabling work, not theirs, but they're not going to connect because, for example, they're an offshore wind farm or they're a nuclear project for another 10 years. So can I connect beforehand, and then you just do the enabling work in the kind of intervening period? So I think there's quite a lot of appetite for change.
And just because there will be, I'm sure, listening into this, there'll be developers and investors who are sitting on accepted offers that might have 2028 and beyond connection timescales, and I know they're going to be interested in, first of all, understanding what the process is going to be, and I know from speaking to you, Pete, it's going to be a long one, so they're not going to suddenly get an answer in their Christmas stocking saying you can connect in 2023. So a couple of things. First of all is just how long are they going to have to wait? But secondly, before you give them that bad news, Pete, when I was off to speak at a conference during the week and I asked you for some stats, and you very kindly just went onto the tech register and had a look, and there were something like 280 7 schemes that do have connection dates after 2025. So we've got to assume that a lot of those are being caught up in these reinforcement works, and 110 of those reference energy storage. So that's an awful lot of connection customers, and that's on the tech register alone. So that doesn't even include all of those schemes that are contracted to connect down the distribution level. So there are potentially hundreds of schemes that might get good news. And you've just been saying that obviously there are some parts of the network, I know this is only England, Wales, but Scotland and up in East Anglia where they might not get such good news. But how many schemes, kind of top of your head, or a proportion, do you think are going to have a significant improvement in connection timescales? And how long, and either of you can have a crack at any of this, and how long are they going to have to wait to find out?
Okay, we can answer the second one much easier than we can answer the first question, Hugh.
Yeah, that's the easy bit. So
Well, yeah, the proportion of customers that might get an improved connection timescale. Oh my, I genuinely don't think I could think of what that number was. You know, there's lots of specific things. You might have to come down to regions perhaps and say, like Catherine was just saying, you know, the East Anglia region looks likely that it might not get that sort of improvement because of those sort of real issues that are out there. There are maybe other areas of the country where there are real issues caused by, you know, offshore wind. I know there's lots of wind programmed for North Wales, you know, area, etc. So I think you might have to do it regionally rather than by sort of specific project. And I genuinely couldn't give you a number. Catherine is now going to give you the number, Hugh.
I think I'm a bit more optimistic, Pete. But well, maybe it's on time frame though, because you know what we're talking about, as you say, Hugh, it's not immediate. So I think within the time frames that it's going to take for people to get their revised offers back through this specific two-stage process to deal with the change in the CPAs, I think within that time frame we're going to get some good news on other fronts. So I think for the people where the CPA assumptions changing doesn't help them, I think there are other things that will. So yeah.
Well, you're talking about the queue management aspects.
Well, lots of things really, actually. So I mean, I guess yeah. So the sort of queue management aspect in terms. Well, no, actually. We use queue management to mean too many different things, don't we? Do you mean kicking people off when they're just sitting on a connection offer that they're not doing anything with?
Oh no, not at all. No, more sort of borrowing, lending capacity.
So sort of delaying enabling works. Yes, I think that could help people. I think kind of re-looking at the tools for non-firm earlier access offers will also help people. I think that some of the holistic network design work may help people. That's obviously happening in the offshore sphere, but it's it's potentially quite radical, I think. So we might end up with brand new, really big bootstraps, which suddenly do solve some of the Scottish problems, or move some of the requirement for onshore transmission reinforcement and just move it offshore. That could benefit onshore projects quite significantly. So I think there are a few things that mean I wouldn't necessarily be crying my eyes out over a late connection date yet.
Yeah, Catherine's clearly far more optimistic in nature.
It's Friday afternoon.
Just on the timescales one, Hugh, I think that's probably a little bit easier to answer in terms of a ballpark. I think it certainly looks like that this two-stage offer process for new connections is going to be introduced very soon. Which means that new offers that are coming out, from maybe even as soon as sort of early December, are going to have this two-stage process in which National Grid are just putting in place to give themselves a little bit of breathing room, whilst they then go back and revise all the existing accepted offers. And I think National Grid are looking at revising those accepted offers over the next sort of 6, 9, 12 months. So it's in that sort of time frame. I think probably within 12 months, a lot of customers are going to have a revised offer that they're going to be able to look at, and some customers are going to have revised offers sooner than that. So it certainly looks like it's going to be happening relatively quickly from a National Grid point of view.
If I was a power systems engineer in National Grid, I'd feel like I was going to have a busy 5 months.
Yes,
and we've obviously got a huge number of clients with an awful lot of projects. A lot of them transmission connected, and but also a lot of the distribution connected, and I'm hoping that you're going to be giving lots of them sort of some fairly warm feelings going into the festive period. It depends where they are. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think so.
And maybe where they are in their project process as well. Like, I think maybe that is the, not to end on a down note, but the thing to perhaps be wary of is that this apply to everything. So it doesn't matter if you're applying for a brand new connection or they're revising your existing offer, or you have you're a year away from connecting, or maybe 2 years away from connecting, and you wanted to do what you thought was a fairly straightforward mod app, to perhaps kind of tweak your tech or something, and you might get pulled into this process. So I think for people with advanced connections, where you're going to be needing to mod app or something, that's where I'd be feeling uncomfortable about this.
Right, and also I understand that the tech amnesty so far, and the sort of clock is ticking on the closing of.
It's Wednesday, next Wednesday.
Yeah, Wednesday, and I think you were saying that very few people have actually expressed interest. Is that right?
Yeah, which I mean is what was kind of expected. So National Grid said on Thursday it was 170 something megawatts of interest they'd had, which is obviously pretty.
I think the problem
beans.
is that those. People who are holding those schemes, they haven't heard your podcast on the tech amnesty and the clever things that you can do. So hopefully by the time Wednesday comes around, they will have done, and they might sort of pitch in. I think Christmas is fast approaching, as is kind of Friday drinks time. So thank you both very much. I know that you've been on calls all day with clients, and so it has been back to back. And so thank you for using the end of your energies mentally, so at the end of the week and at the end of the Friday to explain all this to us. It is I'm going to go into the weekend and Christmas thinking it's very exciting, and loads of these schemes are going to move forwards, even if I'm just being a little bit over optimistic. But hopefully there will be lots of people who get good news. So yes, thank you both very much, and catch you on Monday.
Thanks you.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttaylor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Road Knight Taylor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttaylor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.